In every village, in every corner of the English countryside, there lived a woman who knew the old ways. She was called by many names: the herb wife, the cunning woman, the wise woman. When the doctor was too far away or too expensive, when a child burned with fever in the night, or an old man's joints ached with the coming rain, it was to her cottage door that people came. She knew which plants to pick and when, which roots held healing in their bark, which flowers could ease a troubled mind into peaceful sleep. Her knowledge had been passed down through generations, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild, an unbroken chain of whispered wisdom stretching back through centuries. These women lived on the edges, the edge of the village, the edge of the forest, the edge between the known and the mysterious. They were respected, sometimes feared, always needed. And in their gardens, summer never quite ended. The scent of lavender and rosemary drifted through open windows, and remedies for every ailment lined their shelves in bottles of dark glass. This is a story of one such woman and the quiet magic of an ordinary day in her extraordinary life. Come in, dear visitor. Come in from the summer heat. The shop is cool today, and there is something special I want to show you. Do you notice that scent? That soft purple sweetness drifting through the air. Here, let me bring it closer. A small bottle of dark green glass, no larger than my palm. The cork is old and crumbling at the edges, and the paper label has faded to the colour of tea-stained parchment. But look, you can still read the careful handwriting, Lavandula angustifolia, and below that, in smaller letters, a date, June 1885. Feel how cool the glass is, even on this warm afternoon. And inside, dried lavender flowers still holding their colour after all these years, still holding their scent. Lift it to your nose. There, that fragrance that seems to unlock something in your memory, something peaceful and safe and half forgotten. This bottle came from a cottage in the Cotswolds, from the home of a woman they called the Wise Woman of Hartwell Green. Her name was Ivy Bramwell. She lived alone at the edge of the village, in a house so covered with climbing roses that you could barely see the stone beneath. And every day, from the first light of dawn to the last glow of sunset, she tended her garden and her patients with the same gentle care. Let me tell you about one summer day in her life. A day like any other, and yet, like all ordinary days, full of small miracles. Ivy Bramwell woke before the sun, as she had done every morning for as long as she could remember. The cottage was still dark, the only light a faint grey glow seeping through the gap in the curtains. Outside, a blackbird had begun its morning song, the first voice in the dawn chorus that would soon fill the air with music. She lay still for a moment, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders, the stiffness in her fingers that came with 55 years of work. The bed was warm, the quilts heavy and soft, and part of her wanted nothing more than to sink back into sleep. But the herbs would not wait. The dew would not last. And somewhere in the village, she knew, Someone would need her before the day was done. She rose slowly, her bare feet finding the cold flagstones of the floor. The cottage was small, just 2 rooms below and a sleeping loft above, but it held everything she needed. The main room served as kitchen, workroom and parlour all at once. A large hearth dominated one wall, its stones blackened from decades of fires. Above it, dried herbs hung in bunches from the low ceiling, lavender and chamomile, rosemary and thyme, sage and yarrow, fever, few and elderflower. They rustled softly in the draught from the chimney, filling the air with a fragrance that was both medicinal and comforting. Ivy knelt before the hearth and stirred the embers from the night before. A few small sticks, a handful of dried grass, and soon a new flame was flickering to life. She added larger pieces of wood, watching the fire grow, feeling its warmth begin to push back the morning chill. The kettle went on to boil. While she waited, she washed her face in the basin by the window, the water cool and sharp against her skin. She dressed in her work clothes, a simple cotton dress the colour of faded bluebells, an apron with deep pockets for collecting herbs, sturdy boots that had walked 1,000 miles through garden and forest and field. Her tea was a blend of her own making, chamomile for calm, mint for clarity, a touch of honey from her own hives. She sat by the window and drank it slowly, watching the sky turn from grey to pink to gold. The blackbird was joined now by robins and wrens, by thrushes and finches, by the cooing of wood pigeons in the oak tree at the bottom of the garden. This was her favourite hour. The hour between night and day, when the world held its breath and anything seemed possible. She had been a midwife once, years ago, and she had noticed that most babies chose this hour to be born. As if they knew somehow that dawn was the best time for beginnings. By the time the sun had fully risen, Ivy was in her garden. It was not a large garden, perhaps 1/2 acre in all, but every inch of it was planted, tended, and loved. Narrow paths of worn brick wound between the beds, and everywhere you looked, there was something growing. Near the cottage, the kitchen herbs clustered together, parsley and sage, rosemary and thyme, chives with their purple pom-pom flowers, basil that she had to replant every year because it could not survive the English winters. Further out, the medicinal plants spread in organised profusion, a whole bed devoted to lavender, its grey-green leaves already silvered with dew, its flower spikes just beginning to show their purple. Another bed for chamomile, the small white flowers like tiny daisies nodding in the morning breeze. Feverfew grew in a sunny corner, its bitter leaves a remedy for headaches. Comfrey spread its broad leaves beside the garden wall, its roots excellent for poultices. Valerian, which helped with sleep. Tangled with motherwort, which helped with women's complaints in a slightly wild patch near the old apple tree. And everywhere, the bees. Ivy kept 3 hives at the far end of the garden, and their inhabitants were already at work, moving from flower to flower in their ancient dance, She loved the sound of them, that low, contented hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Bees and herbalists had always been partners, she thought. The bees made honey, which healed wounds and soothed throats and preserved medicines, and in return the herbs provided them with everything they needed. She moved through the bed slowly, a basket over her arm, her fingers gentle as she harvested. The lavender was ready. She cut the long stems just as the flowers were beginning to open when the oil content was highest. The chamomile she picked flower by flower, leaving the stems to produce more blooms. From the rose bushes that climbed the cottage walls, she gathered petals, soft as silk and fragrant as summer itself. The dew was already beginning to evaporate, the sun warming the earth, and she worked steadily, filling her basket with the morning's gifts. A robin landed nearby and watched her with its bright black eye, hoping perhaps for a worm turned up by her work. A butterfly, orange and black, settled on a lavender spike and slowly opened and closed its wings. This is prayer, Ivy thought, though she would never have said it aloud. This is church. These green growing things, this warm earth, these small creatures going about their lives. What cathedral could compare to this? The knock came mid-morning, when Ivy was in her workroom stringing the lavender to dry. She knew before she opened the door who it would be. She had heard the footsteps on the path, hurried, anxious, the particular rhythm of a mother carrying a sick child. And when she lifted the latch, there stood young Sarah Whitmore, her 2-year-old son Thomas cradled against her chest. The child was flushed with fever, his eyes glassy, his breathing rough and rattling. Sarah's own face was pale with fear and lack of sleep. "Come in," Ivy said, and her voice was calm, unhurried, as warm as the fire in the hearth. "Come in and sit down. Let me see him." Sarah sank into the chair by the fire, still clutching Thomas as if she feared he might slip away if she loosened her grip. The child whimpered, then coughed. A deep, barking cough that seemed to shake his whole small body. Ivy examined him gently. She felt his forehead, hot as a coal. She looked at his throat, red and swollen. She listened to his chest, hearing the congestion that rattled with every breath. A summer cold, she thought, made worse by the sudden change in weather. Nothing that could not be mended. She moved about the room, gathering what she needed. From the shelf, a jar of dried elderflowers, excellent for fever. Another jar of thyme to ease the cough. Honey from her own hives, thick and golden. She measured and mixed, adding hot water, stirring slowly, murmuring instructions as she worked. "A spoonful every hour," she said, pouring the mixture into a small brown bottle. "And keep him warm, but not too warm. Let him sleep as much as he will. By tomorrow he will be better. But what if he is not?" Sarah's voice trembled. What if the fever does not break? Ivy looked at her, this young mother with shadows under her eyes and fear in her heart. She remembered being that young, that frightened, that convinced that every illness was a disaster waiting to happen. She reached out and took Sarah's hand. "He will be well," she said gently. "Children are stronger than we think. And this," she held up the bottle, "this has healed 100 coughs before his. Trust the herbs, trust your own care, and trust him. He wants to get better." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She tucked the bottle into her apron pocket, adjusted Thomas in her arms, and headed for the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Thank you, Mrs. Bramwell. I do not know what we would do without you." Ivy smiled. "You would manage. You always do. Now go home and rest when he rests. You need healing too." She watched them go down the path, the mother and child, until they disappeared around the bend in the lane. Then she returned to her lavender, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar task, her mind already half dreaming of the forest she would visit that afternoon. The cottage grew warm as the sun climbed higher. Ivy opened the windows to let in the breeze, and the scent of the garden drifted through every room. She ate her midday meal at the old oak table, bread she had baked herself, cheese from the farm down the lane, tomatoes still warm from the vine. Simple food, but satisfying. After eating, she turned to the work of preparation. The herbs she had gathered that morning needed to be processed before they lost their potency. The lavender went into bundles, tied with string, and hung from the ceiling to dry. The chamomile flowers she spread on a clean cloth, arranging them in a single layer so the air could circulate. The rose petals she layered with sugar in a glass jar, where they would slowly transform into a fragrant preserve that was good for sore throats and sad hearts alike. Her workroom was lined with shelves, and every shelf was crowded with bottles and jars. Tinctures stood in rows, dark liquids in dark glass, each one labelled in her careful hand. Salves and ointments filled small ceramic pots. Dried herbs waited in paper bags and muslin sachets. Everything had its place, its purpose, its proper use. She opened her recipe book, a fat volume bound in leather that had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. The pages were stained and spotted, the handwriting a palimpsest of 3 generations. Here was her grandmother's recipe for a cough syrup made with wild cherry bark. There was her mother's remedy for sleeplessness, written in a hand that Ivy still recognized with a pang of love. And scattered throughout, her own additions, notes and observations, refinements and discoveries, the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of practice. She was making a new batch of elderflower cordial when the cat appeared. His name was Bracken, and he was as much a part of the cottage as the herbs and the hearth. A large orange tabby with a torn ear and knowing eyes, he had arrived on her doorstep 5 years ago and simply refused to leave. Now he spent his days sleeping in patches of sunlight and his nights hunting in the meadows, returning at dawn with mysterious gifts that Ivy did her best to appreciate. He jumped onto the table and sat watching her work, his tail curled around his paws. Ivy reached out and scratched behind his ears, feeling his purr vibrate through her fingers. "What do you think?" she asked him. "Is it sweet enough?" Bracken blinked slowly, which Ivy chose to interpret as approval. She added another spoonful of honey, stirred the cordial one last time, and set it aside to cool. In the early afternoon, when the heat of the day had passed its peak, Ivy took up her basket and her walking stick and headed for the woods. The path led through the meadow behind her cottage, where wildflowers nodded in the warm breeze and grasshoppers leaped away from her feet. Then through a gap in the old stone wall and into the cool green shade of the forest. She had walked these woods all her life. She knew every path, every clearing, every hollow tree and mossy stone. She knew where the wild garlic grew in spring, carpeting the forest floor with white flowers. She knew where to find the best blackberries in autumn, the bushes hidden in a sunny clearing where the deer could not reach them. And she knew where the rarer herbs grew, the ones that could not be cultivated, that had to be gathered wild, that held the deepest and most powerful healing. Today she was looking for St. John's wort. It was past midsummer now, and the golden flowers would be at their peak, ready to be harvested for the oil that eased sore muscles and lifted melancholy spirits. She had a particular spot in mind, a south-facing bank where the plants grew thick and tall. The forest was alive around her. Birds called from the canopy, their songs echoing in the green cathedral of leaves. A squirrel chattered angrily at her intrusion, then bounded away through the branches. Somewhere nearby, a stream murmured over stones, a sound like gentle laughter. She found the St. John's wort where she expected it, the plants covered in bright yellow flowers that seemed to glow in the dappled light. She knelt on the soft earth and began to gather, taking only every third plant, leaving enough to reseed and grow again next year. This was the old way, the sustainable way, the way her grandmother had taught her. Take what you need, leave what you can. The forest will provide, but only if you treat it with respect. As she worked, her mind drifted into that peaceful state that came with familiar tasks. She thought about Sarah and little Thomas and sent a silent wish for his recovery. She thought about the seasons turning, about the herbs she would need to gather before autumn came. She thought about nothing at all, simply existing in the present moment, her hands in the earth, the sun warm on her back, the forest breathing all around her. When her basket was full, she sat for a while on a fallen log, eating an apple she had brought from home and listening to the stream. A dragonfly hovered nearby, its wings catching the light like stained glass. A family of deer moved through the distant trees, stepping delicately, pausing to browse on the undergrowth. This is enough, she thought. This life, this work, this solitude that was not lonely but simply quiet. She had been married once, had raised children who were now grown and scattered to their own lives in distant towns and cities. She had known grief and loss and the kind of sorrow that made you wonder if morning would ever come again. But morning always came, and with it the garden, the herbs, the steady rhythm of useful work. She rose, brushed the leaves from her skirt, and headed home. Thomas Harding was waiting on her doorstep when she returned. He was an old man now, though Ivy remembered him as a young farmer with strong arms and a quick laugh. That was 40 years ago, when they had both been different people in a different world. Now his hair was white, his back bent, his hands gnarled with arthritis that made every task a struggle. "Mrs. Bramwell," he said, his voice still surprisingly deep. "I hate to trouble you." "It is no trouble, Mr. Harding. Come in, come in. Sit by the fire." She helped him to the chair that Sarah had occupied that morning, and he sank into it with a sigh of relief. His knees, she noticed, were giving him pain again. And his hands. She could see how he held them, slightly curled, trying to find a position that did not hurt. "The weather is changing," he said, as if apologizing for his ailments. "I can always feel it in my bones." The weather was indeed changing. The clear blue sky of the morning had given way to high white clouds, and there was a new dampness in the air that spoke of rain to come. Ivy's own joints were aching slightly, a sympathy with the coming storm. "Let me make you some tea," she said, "and then we will see what we can do for those hands." She brewed a pot of willow bark tea, which had been easing pain since before anyone could remember. While it steeped, she took down a jar of the salve she made for cases like this: comfrey and arnica, beeswax and lavender oil, all mixed together into a smooth, fragrant balm. She took his hands in hers, gently, and began to work the salve into his swollen joints. The skin was papery and thin, the knuckles knotted like old tree roots, but as she massaged, she felt the tension begin to ease, the muscles to relax. They talked as she worked. About his garden, which was not as productive as it once had been. About his grandchildren, who visited when they could, but not as often as he would like. About the old days, when the village had been larger and everyone had known everyone else's business, for better or worse. "Do you remember," he said, "when you helped my Mary bring our first child into the world?" Ivy smiled. "I remember. A boy. You named him William after your father. William has 3 children of his own now, lives in Manchester, works in a factory." He shook his head. "I do not understand this new world, Mrs. Bramwell. Everything moves so fast. Everyone is always rushing somewhere." She handed him his tea, wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "The world has always been changing," she said gently. "And people have always been rushing. We just notice it more as we get older." He laughed, a dry, rusty sound. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I am just a foolish old man, wishing for things that never really existed." "Not foolish," she said, "just human." We all look back and see the past as gentler than it was. But Mr. Harding, she met his eyes, those faded blue eyes that had seen so much. The good things were real too. The kindness, the community, the way people helped each other. Those things still exist. They just look different now. He nodded slowly, sipping his tea. "You are wise, Mrs. Bramwell, wiser than most." "I am old," she corrected him, smiling. It is not the same thing, but it sometimes looks similar. When he left, an hour later, he was walking a little straighter. The salve would help for a few days, and she had sent him home with a pot of it and a bag of willow bark for tea. It was not a cure. Nothing could cure what time had done to his body, but it was comfort, and sometimes comfort was enough. The afternoon faded into evening, and Ivy's cottage filled with the golden light of the setting sun. She lit the lamps and stirred up the fire, then turned to the tasks of preservation that would keep her supplied through the winter months. The St. John's wort needed to be processed while it was fresh. She filled a glass jar with the golden flowers, then covered them with olive oil, pressing down to release the air bubbles. Over the next few weeks, the oil would turn a deep ruby red as it absorbed the healing properties of the plant. It would be ready by autumn, in time for the season of aches and melancholy. She checked on the elderflower cordial, which had cooled enough to bottle. She strained it through muslin, the liquid clear and golden, smelling of summer itself. Each bottle she labelled carefully and set on the shelf with the others, a row of captured sunlight that would brighten the dark days of January and February. The rose petal preserve was developing nicely, the petals softening in the sugar, their colour deepening. She gave it a gentle stir and returned it to its cool corner. As she worked, she hummed an old song her mother had taught her, something about a maiden and a rose and a love that lasted through the seasons. She did not remember all the words anymore, but the melody remained, a thread connecting her to all the women who had hummed it before her in cottages just like this one. Bracken wove between her feet, hoping for his supper. She fed him scraps of the fish she had bought from the man who came through the village twice a week with his cart, then made her own simple meal. Bread again, and soup from the vegetables in her garden, and a slice of the ginger cake that Mrs. Pemberton had brought her last week in exchange for a remedy for her husband's indigestion. Outside, the light was fading, the sky turning from gold to pink to deepening blue. The first stars were appearing, faint points of light in the vast darkness. The birds had fallen silent, and in their place, the evening sounds were beginning. The chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the mysterious rustlings of creatures beginning their nighttime lives. When the dishes were washed and the fire banked for the night, Ivy took her shawl from its hook and stepped outside. The air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers and distant rain. She sat on the old wooden bench beside the door, the same bench where her husband had sat with her on summer evenings long ago, and let the peace of the night settle around her. The garden was a mystery in the darkness, shapes and shadows where by day there were colours and forms. She could hear the bees in their hives, a low, contented murmur as they settled in for the night. Somewhere in the meadow, a fox barked, sharp and wild. Above her, the sky was filling with stars. She tipped her head back and watched them appear, one by one, then in clusters, then in their thousands, until the whole dome of heaven was blazing with ancient light. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of light, and she thought, as she always did, of all the people throughout history who had looked up at this same sky and wondered the same wondering. What a small thing a human life was against all that vastness. And yet what a precious thing too. Each person a whole world, each day a complete story, each small act of kindness or healing a tiny light against the darkness. She thought about young Thomas, hopefully sleeping now with his fever broken. About Mr. Harding, finding a few hours of relief from his pain. About the herbs drying in her cottage, the cordials and salves and tinctures waiting on their shelves, each one a small promise of help when help was needed. This was her calling, her purpose, her prayer made tangible. Not grand or important by the world's standards, not the kind of work that would be remembered in history books or carved on monuments, but good work nonetheless, necessary work, the work of caring for the bodies and spirits of ordinary people living ordinary lives. She sat until the dew began to gather and the chill crept into her bones. Then she rose, stretched her aching back, and went inside. She checked the fire one last time, made sure the cat was in, and climbed the narrow stairs to her sleeping loft. The sheets were cool and soft against her tired body. Through the small window, she could see a single star, bright and steady. She closed her eyes and let the silence of the night wrap around her like a blanket. Tomorrow there would be more work, more herbs to gather, more remedies to make, more people coming to her door with their ailments and their worries. The endless, beautiful cycle of tending and healing that had shaped her life for so many years. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was only this: the warmth of the bed, the whisper of the wind, the vast starry sky wheeling slowly overhead, and somewhere in the quiet of her heart, a feeling like gratitude, like peace, like coming home. She slept. And so, dear visitor, that is the story of Mrs. Ivy Bramwell and her ordinary, extraordinary day. The summer sun that rose over her cottage set again, as it had done 1,000 times before, and would do 1,000 times after, marking the rhythm of a life devoted to growing things and healing things, and the quiet wisdom of paying attention. What became of her? I wonder that sometimes, holding this small bottle with its cargo of dried lavender. She lived to be very old, I like to think, old enough to see the new century dawn, old enough to pass her knowledge to another generation, old enough to sit on that same wooden bench and watch great-grandchildren play in the garden she had tended all her life. The world changed around her, as worlds do. Doctors became more common, medicines more scientific, the old ways slowly fading into memory. But the herbs did not stop working just because people stopped believing in them. The lavender still calmed anxious minds. The chamomile still soothed upset stomachs. The elderflower still brought down fevers, as it had done for centuries before Ivy Bramwell was born, and will do for centuries after we are all forgotten. There is a lesson in her life, I think. Something about the value of small things done well. Something about the courage it takes to live quietly, to find meaning in the daily round, to believe that tending a garden and healing a neighbour matters as much as any grand adventure. In a world that is always rushing toward the next thing, there is wisdom in the woman who stays still, who watches the seasons turn, who knows that some things cannot be hurried and are better for the waiting. Now then, dear visitor, the hour grows late, and the summer evening is calling you to rest. Take this thought with you as you go, the image of a cottage covered in roses, a garden full of healing plants, a woman with gentle hands and knowing eyes, the sound of bees in the lavender, the scent of herbs drying in the rafters, the peace that comes from useful work well done. This old bottle goes back to its shelf now, where it can dream of summer gardens and morning dew and the soft hum of bees moving through the flowers. And somewhere across the years, a wise woman is still tending her herbs, still brewing her teas, still opening her door to whoever needs her help. Sleep well, dear friend, and may you find in your own life the quiet wisdom of the herbalist, the patience to let things grow, the knowledge to nurture what needs nurturing, and the peace that comes from being exactly where you are meant to be.